If you've been looking at any geopolitical sources over the last, say, few years, there are these images that they seem to capture the current tension almost too perfectly. And a lot of them come from this one tiny, isolated spot on the map.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. It's the ballistic missiles.
Exactly. Not in some, secret, heavily fortified military base, but practicing an attack right off a public highway in Kaliningrad.
And that highway deployment, it's probably the most telling detail of all because it's so performative. It's designed to signal readiness, capability.
And what is that capability?
Well, those missiles,
Right.
once they're launched from that very specific forward position, they are capable of reaching major NATO capitals. We're talking about Warsaw, Berlin. And get this, in a genuinely startling 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
3 minutes. That single exercise, just that one image, it really sets the stage for the extreme tension that defines this small, isolated exclave of Russia today.
It's a complete geographic anomaly. I mean, for anyone who tracks the expansion of NATO, you look at the map and Kaliningrad it jumped out at you. It's entirely surrounded by NATO territory.
Entirely. You have Poland to the south, Lithuania to the north and east, and then, of course, the Baltic Sea to the west.
So it's quite literally an island of Russian military influence marooned in what is now basically a NATO ocean.
And that geographical isolation, which is a modern phenomenon, coupled with this profound military significance that, dates back 80 years, it just ensures that it remains a central clash point.
Right.
It's the perfect sort of concentrated embodiment of this cyclical escalation dynamic we've been watching unfold between Russia and the West.
Absolutely. So we've taken that stack of sources you've shared with us, and our mission for this deep dive is to really peel back the layers on Kaliningrad. This place has such a contested past, a very strange economic present, and a very uncertain militarized future. We need to figure out how this relatively small patch of land, which once had this dream of being a European trade hub, became so central to current global tensions and these nuclear shadows.
It's a dense story. It's almost theatrical, really, spanning a century of imperial ambitions, geopolitical shifts, ideologies.
Indeed. So we're going to trace 3 distinct threads through this investigation. First, its deep contested history, how it went from being German Königsberg to Russian Kaliningrad, and, why that specific piece of geography was so coveted in the first place.
Okay.
Second, we're going to analyze that intriguing but, let's be honest, utterly failed economic vision that aimed to transform it into a Baltic Hong Kong.
A really fascinating period, that one.
And finally, we have to confront its current reality. The escalating military posturing and, most critically, this persistent shadow of suspected nuclear capabilities.
It's a compelling journey. You go from an imperial German fortress through its role as the westernmost Soviet outpost, then this, moment of hopeful, if really short-lived, globalization, and, ultimately, right back to a highly militarized standoff.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with how the strategic piece of land ended up where it is today, let's trace that transformation from Königsberg to Kaliningrad.
Right. So the location's strategic importance is, it's ancient. But its role in modern European history was really cemented by the conflicts of the 20th century.
And before all of that, it was German.
Completely. Until the 1940s, this entire region was known as East Prussia, and the city of Königsberg was its capital. And we need to be clear, this wasn't just some regional administrative hub. It was a major strategic and, cultural center for Germany.
The sources really emphasized just how large and important it was. This wasn't some sleepy border town.
Not at all.
It was one of Germany's 10 largest cities. It had a thriving population of over 370,000 people before the heavy wartime bombing and the final military assault.
And the destruction and depopulation, it really represented this monumental loss of infrastructure, of history, of culture.
So to understand why it was such a high-value target, you said we have to look at the geography. What is it about that specific spot on the Baltic coast?
Okay, so if you look at a map of the coastline, Königsberg itself sits a little bit inland on the Progolia River. And that river connected out to 2 huge lagoons, the Vistula Lagoon and the even larger Curonian Lagoon.
And these are shallow, protected waters, right?
Exactly. But what makes those lagoons so critical in a military context is the sea access.
Ah.
The lagoons are mostly closed off from the Baltic Sea. The only natural navigable deep water entrance is a single, very narrow strait. And that strait is controlled by the city of Baltisk, which sits right at the mouth.
I see. So whoever controls that one little choke point at Baltisk, effectively controls this massive protected naval basin.
You've got it. It creates a profoundly protected, naturally defensible deep-water shelter for naval forces. That is, and this is crucial, ice-free year-round.
Which is a huge deal in the Baltic.
A huge deal.
Yeah.
So for Germany, controlling this location meant they could base significant naval assets, they could base troops extremely close to the Soviet border without being exposed to open sea attacks. It was a pivotal military staging area.
So it was both a protected harbor and an advanced offensive platform, which of course brings us to the Soviet perspective. It seems like this became a non-negotiable objective for Stalin very, very quickly.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just a spoil of war that they picked up at the end. It was a foundational piece of their post-war strategy, and it was established years before the final victory.
And we know this from where?
The critical insight comes from the Tehran Conference documents back in 1943. So as the war was just beginning to turn in the Allies' favor, Stalin made it vividly and consistently clear to both Roosevelt and Churchill that the Soviet Union required permanent, year-round access to warm water ports on the Baltic Sea.
And he specifically named Königsberg.
He explicitly named Königsberg as the location he intended to annex.
Wow, that's fascinating detail. It wasn't just some vague demand for territorial adjustments in the Baltic. It was pinpointed. He knew exactly what he wanted.
Precisely. Stalin argued that access to the Baltic was historically necessary for Russian security, for their power projection, and he was citing all these historical precedents. And the fact that the port could operate year-round, unlike many of Russia's northern ports that freeze over, just made it indispensable.
So from that moment in 1943, it was a done deal in his mind.
It became a fixed, non-negotiable Soviet war aim. It was strategically planned as part of their long-term vision for projecting power into Central Europe.
The actual transformation, though, was cataclysmic. By the time the Soviet forces finally took control of the city, it was just pulverized.
Completely. It had already suffered these massive Allied bombing raids that decimated the historic center, and then the subsequent Soviet siege just finished the job.
And then came the demographic shift.
And it was swift, and it was brutal. The city was in ruins, and the new Soviet administration carried out a systematic campaign to eliminate any German presence. The remaining German population either fled westward in the chaos of the war's end, or they were formally expelled in the years immediately following.
The scale of that shift is it's hard to comprehend.
It is. You're talking about almost 500,000 Germans being replaced entirely by Soviet citizens, mostly from Russia and Belarus. It was a fundamental severing of the region's historical and cultural roots.
And then the renaming to Kaliningrad after Mikhail Kalin, a key Bolshevik figure, that was the official final step, right? Purging that German identity.
Yes, but the strategic gain, that always remained the core prize.
The territory itself.
The territory was invaluable. They secured the city, the surrounding lands, but most importantly, they secured control of that critical narrow opening to the sea at Baltisk.
And Baltisk immediately becomes...
It immediately became the primary, most forward base of the entire Soviet Baltic fleet.
So in just a few years, a highly defensible, very valuable German asset had been entirely converted into a core Soviet offensive and power projection platform.
Absolutely. And then as the Cold War crystallized, its strategic value just grew exponentially. With Poland and East Germany integrated into the Warsaw Pact, Kaliningrad became the undisputed westernmost outpost of the entire Soviet Empire.
The tip of the spear.
Exactly. It was the essential platform for deploying Soviet naval forces, ground forces, projecting dominance directly into the newly acquired territories of Poland and the recently annexed Baltic states. It was a tip of the spear into Western Europe.
It's hard to imagine a more perfect staging ground for them. However, as we know, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And that immense military significance seemed, well, for a brief window, it seemed to diminish. The global focus shifted.
It did. The focus shifted to economics, and for nearly a decade, the military importance declined. And that really set the stage for what should have been a very different future for Kaliningrad.
Because Russia itself was in crisis.
Russia was facing a deep and, frankly, painful economic crisis in the 90s. It was all instability and privatization chaos. But right next door, the newly independent Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, they chose a drastically different path.
They looked west. They gained their independence and then very rapidly began the process of integrating with Western institutions.
Right, which all culminated in their successful entry into the European Union.
And that integration was absolutely crucial, wasn't it? It wasn't just political.
No, not at all. It didn't just provide political stability, it granted them access to enormous EU structural funding and, critically, entry into some of the wealthiest export markets in the world. And that fueled this period of genuinely remarkable economic growth. People called it the Baltic Tigers phenomenon.
And Russian leaders, struggling to rebuild their own shattered economy, they're watching all this happen right on their border.
Keenly. They recognized that their small, isolated exclave of Kaliningrad, now surrounded by all this newfound European wealth and dynamism, held the exact same underlying geographic assets that had made it so important militarily for decades.
The port.
The deepwater port, the ice-free access, and its unique proximity to Western Europe. They theorized that these factors could be repurposed.
So instead of being conditions for military power projection,
they could become the conditions for rapid civilian-led economic growth.
And this is where that pervasive, really aspirational idea of the Baltic Hong Kong analogy comes from.
That analogy was so potent because Hong Kong was the perfect model at the time. A capitalist, semi-autonomous port city that functioned as the vital trade hub, successfully linking the enormous closed economy of communist China to the open markets and investment of the West.
And the hope was that Kaliningrad could do the same thing for Russia.
Exactly. It could act as Russia's essential cooperative trade bridge with the European Union.
But the reality on the ground, especially in the 1990s, was, well, it was starkly different from that dream, wasn't it? The sources suggest those early efforts were pretty unfocused.
And saw very little tangible success. Moscow was just too disorganized, too financially crippled to implement any coherent strategy.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, Europe was, it was focused inward.
Germany.
The monumental task of integrating a reunified Germany and then all the preparations for Eastern European expansion that consumed the EU's focus in its capital. So Western interest in investing heavily in a Russian exclave, especially one with such a complicated history, was pretty minimal.
So things basically just stalled until the early 2000s when Vladimir Putin decided to push a more focused policy?
Yes, that's when things started to change. To mark the 750th anniversary of Kaliningrad in 2005, Putin formalized the creation of a powerful special economic zone, or an SEZ.
And this was a centralized project from the start.
Absolutely. He appointed a governor he could personally control and granted Moscow the final authority over all strategic decisions. It was a clear signal. This was a federal project run from the center.
The establishment of that SEZ, though, it was followed by a pretty measurable economic uptick. The sources are clear that the policies did have a significant, if maybe a distorted effect.
They absolutely did.
Yeah.
Once that SEZ structure was in place and it offered tax breaks, duty exemptions for goods imported into Kaliningrad and then subsequently re-exported or shipped to the Russian mainland, the value of imports just skyrocketed.
It became a loophole.
Kaliningrad quickly became recognized as a major loophole for importing cheaper EU products into the heavily protected Russian mainland market.
Can we just pause on that for a second? Let's look at how those SEZ policies were structured, because it seems like they were designed to benefit external actors more than local development. That feels critical to why it all eventually failed.
It's the absolute hinge point of the story.
Yeah.
So the SEZ offered zero import duties on components used to manufacture goods within the zone, provided those goods were then exported. Now, that sounds great for local manufacturing, right?
It sounds perfect.
But the rules and the logistics often favored massive enterprises. For instance, you needed enormous scale and substantial upfront capital just to meet the minimum investment thresholds and manage all the complex customs guarantees.
So small, local Kaliningrad businesses, they couldn't even get a foot in the door.
They simply couldn't compete. They couldn't access the benefits. The whole structure of the SEZ was perfectly calibrated for large existing firms, most of which were based or headquartered in Moscow or overseas, to set up massive assembly operations in Kaliningrad.
Basically using the zone as a giant subsidized factory floor.
That is the precise mechanism. And that structure led directly to the rise of this one company, Avtofer, which became the perfect illustration of this whole loophole manufacturing system.
Avtofer was critical. They struck these major deals with global car manufacturers like Kia, Hyundai, and even BMW to assemble their cars in the exclave.
Right. And this auto industry boom, combined with the assembly of high-volume electronics like TV sets, it came to completely dominate the export economy.
Dominate is the right word. We're talking about an overwhelming concentration.
Completely. Collectively, car and electronics assembly made up 3/4 of all exports leaving Kaliningrad at the height of the SEZ's so-called success.
Which means, superficially, someone could point to some impressive GDP growth and say, look, the SEZ strategy is working.
And people did.
But when you actually compare Kaliningrad against the Baltic states it was supposed to be emulating, the sources show a total failure of perspective.
That is the core realization you have to grasp. While they had GDP growth, yes, the exclave lagged dramatically in actual prosperity. They were far, far behind their Baltic peers in GDP per capita.
So the wealth that was being generated wasn't really being distributed among the population.
Not widely, no. And furthermore, they were inferior in the total overall value of their exports and imports. It suggests the scale of their trade hub was tiny compared to the integrated economies of, say, Vilnius or Desk.
So the grand vision, this independent, cooperative bridge between East and West, it failed. It failed entirely.
It did, and the sources suggest this failure was perhaps less accidental and more of a calculated consequence of Moscow's larger political strategy.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture of Putin's initial political goals, the evidence is pretty compelling. The SEZ model, as we just detailed, disproportionately benefited these huge firms based in Moscow.
Right.
They were the ones who harvested the profits, they established the supply lines, while Kaliningrad itself remained structurally weak and economically specialized into just one or two assembly sectors.
So the policy actually achieved centralization. It made sure Moscow got most of the benefits, while Kaliningrad remained utterly dependent on federal subsidies and the contiguity of those big external firms.
Exactly. Putin's priority, it seems, was not to foster an independent, dynamic regional economy that might generate, alternative centers of power. His goal was to centralize all power in Moscow.
And by making Kaliningrad so heavily reliant on federal budget transfers and external corporate decisions, he successfully dismantled the very possibility of that Baltic Hong Kong dream.
The stage was set for the inevitable re-emphasis on the military mission.
That transition is so crucial, because as that economic dream was fading, the political landscape shifted dramatically with NATO expansion, which it paved the way for the return of overt militarization.
It did.
But before we get into the military buildup, I think we need to understand the social and economic fragility of the people who actually live there today, especially now in the wake of all the recent sanctions.
We have to acknowledge the brittle society that this centralization created. You have a hyper-concentrated economy paired with a really peculiar demographic reality. The census data, when you look at it closely, is extremely revealing about the quality of life outside the main city.
Okay, so the exclave is roughly 15,000 square kilometers, about the size of Connecticut, I think.
Roughly, yeah.
But it has about 1 million inhabitants, and yet less than half of that million lives in the main city of Kaliningrad itself.
And the urban structure it's highly decentralized. The second largest city in the whole oblast has fewer than 40,000 inhabitants.
Yeah.
So you have this massive population just dispersed across the territory.
The research team was really meticulous in tracking this specific metric, and what they found is this surprising reality. Hundreds of thousands of people are living in small, often remote rural communities. The census identifies over 1,000 tiny settlements.
1,000.
Each ranging from only 1 to 2,000 people.
Which means the image of Kaliningrad as this dense cosmopolitan industrial hub it's fundamentally misleading. The social reality for the majority of the inhabitants is life in these small villages and rural settlements. And that reality is completely inseparable from the economy.
And their economy, as you said, relies overwhelmingly on two external factors: federal subsidies from Moscow to keep the lights on, and the constant pervasive presence of the military for local employment.
We have to stress that economic over-reliance point again. Just look at the AFTOTR data from before 2022. They were the single biggest taxpayer in the entire oblast.
How big?
They were responsible for a staggering 52% of all collected taxes in 2021.
Wow, 52%. From one company.
That level of dependency on one firm, tied to one very narrow sector, is almost unprecedented in a major region. It's an incredible vulnerability.
And their dominance wasn't just financial, right? It was infrastructural.
Completely. AFTOTR cars accounted for 70% of all container traffic moving through the ports. 70%. And 42% of all rail cargo connecting the exclave to the Russian mainland.
That is a crucial detail. Because when we talk about sanctions, we have to understand that infrastructural impact. If AvTotar's supply chain falters, the whole logistics network, the ports, the rail, the customs workers, the whole system that was designed to move those vehicles just grinds to a halt.
It's not just a factory closing. It's the regional supply chain collapsing in on itself.
And that implosion was swift after the large-scale conflict in Ukraine began. Western sanctions targeted the automotive sector specifically, hitting everything from the high-tech parts needed for modern assembly to the ability to even export the finished product.
The decline was catastrophic, and it was immediate. Car production declined by a staggering 66% in the first year alone.
66%.
And while there were some attempts to pivot to Chinese and domestic production, output still declined a further 37% the subsequent year. This wasn't a soft landing. It was a profound economic shockwave that just cascaded through the ports, the rail lines, and local employment figures.
So the outcome is this vicious feedback loop. The region has an extremely limited domestic economy because the Hong Kong dream was crushed. It has restricted access to foreign markets because of sanctions, and consequently, it has an even greater, almost existential dependence on the federal government just to function.
And this reliance is stabilized and, in a way, enforced by the constant military presence. For the population living in Kaliningrad City, the Baltic Fleet headquarters are just. They're omnipresent. But even in those smaller villages you mentioned, the military infrastructure is pervasive. It employs a significant portion of the local workforce.
The analysis estimates that somewhere between 3% and 6% of the working population is directly employed by the military.
That is an enormous density of military employment for what's supposed to be a civilian economy. The military isn't just stationed there. It is the single largest, most reliable employer and the primary engine of the regional labor force.
And the infrastructure itself is built for them.
That's a key point. The entire regional infrastructure, from specific road surfaces to the depth of the port channels, the density of rail lines, is specifically designed and maintained to serve the military's logistical needs to the fullest extent, often, superseding civilian requirements.
So that structural reality where the economy is fundamentally inseparable from the military mission, a region basically built for war and dependency, that sets the stage for what we need to talk about next, the escalation cycle and the return to this overt Cold War-style posturing.
Right. The serious push for the remilitarization of Kaliningrad began in the late 1990s, and it accelerated rapidly as NATO expanded eastward.
Here's to include Poland.
And then the Baltic states. Russia viewed this as a completely unacceptable encroachment on its sphere of influence.
And there was a key trigger point highlighted in the sources, which was the U.S. plan to deploy missile defense systems in Europe.
Yes. Specifically, the plan to deploy 10 interceptors in northern Poland missiles designed specifically to target incoming ballistic threats, implicitly or, explicitly, from Kaliningrad.
And there was also debate about a radar station in the Czech Republic.
Yes, and that powerful radar station added to Russia's perception that NATO was building this robust anti-ballistic missile shield right on its borders. Russia interpreted these defensive steps, particularly the Aegis Ashore system planned for Poland, not as protection against rogue states, but as a direct challenge to its own strategic deterrence capabilities.
And Russia's response was massive. It involved a staggering increase in defense spending over that period. I think they effectively tripled it.
They did. And this is the classic cyclical tension we need to highlight.
It's the defining geopolitical loop of the region, isn't it?
It is. Russia claims its heightened militarization and forward deployment are purely a necessary response to NATO expansion and missile defense plans.
Meanwhile, NATO claims its defensive steps, the missile interceptors, the forward presence, are solely a response to Russia's already escalating military posture in Kaliningrad.
And both sides are constantly reacting to the perceived aggression of the other, which just guarantees perpetual tension.
The result has been the decisive hardening of Kaliningrad. We've seen Russia and Belarus organizing these huge, large-scale combined military exercises, often simulating an invasion or a swift defense, as a powerful show of force.
And the hardware they've deployed in the exclave is highly significant. It represents Russia's most advanced conventional deterrent. We are talking about the deployment of short-range, nuclear-capable ballistic missiles.
The Iskander system.
Specifically the Iskander-M system, yeah. Along with Russia's most advanced air defense systems, the S-400 Triumph.
The Iskander system really is a game changer because of its capability and its speed. Can you just elaborate on why that specific platform is such a powerful deterrent?
The Iskander is critical because of its operational advantages. It has a range of approximately 600 kilometers, which means from Kaliningrad it can reach deep into Germany, Poland, the Baltic states.
And it's dual capable.
Critically, it's a dual capable system. It can carry both conventional high-explosive warheads and tactical nuclear warheads.
Yeah.
Furthermore, the missile itself follows a low-altitude quasi-ballistic trajectory. It can perform complex maneuvers in flight, which makes it exceptionally difficult for current air defense systems, like the Patriot or even the planned Aegis Ashore, to intercept.
And those are the very missiles we mentioned at the very beginning, the ones seen practicing attacks from a public highway.
Yes, that exercise underscores the concept of shoot and scoot. Mobility is prioritized. The highway deployment signals operational readiness, the ability to quickly deploy from a hidden location, launch, and then immediately relocate to avoid a counterattack.
And it reinforces their capability to strike those major population centers like Warsaw and Berlin in that terrifyingly short 3-minute flight time. It gives NATO almost no warning.
Precisely.
So faced with this clear forward military threat, NATO, of course, has significantly enhanced its own preparedness. I mean, following Russia's aggression in Ukraine, NATO organized its largest military exercise in over a decade.
It did, yeah. It involved nearly 40,000 soldiers, and it was purely to demonstrate cohesion and rapid readiness.
And this was solidified by a key strategic policy, the Enhanced Forward Presence, or EFP.
Yes, this was a direct, persistent, multinational deployment of combat-ready battalions placed directly on the eastern flank.
And the composition of those battalions, who is in them, that's key to the deterrent strategy, isn't it?
Absolutely. The deployments are explicitly multinational. You have U.S. troops in Poland, Germany acting as the lead nation in Lithuania, Canada in Latvia, and the UK in Estonia.
It's a tripwire.
The strategy is often called the tripwire strategy, and it's brilliant in its simplicity. By ensuring that an attack on any one of those eastern flank nations automatically guarantees the direct involvement of multiple major NATO states, including the U.S. and Germany, they immediately raise the political and military cost of any initial aggression to prohibitive levels for Russia.
That commitment to collective defense is palpable on the ground now. And beyond those forward battalions, NATO also dramatically increased its formal response force. What was it, from 13,000 to 40,000 troops?
It did, and it restructured its command, creating 8 new regional headquarters to improve coordinated regional command and rapid response to any threat involving Kaliningrad.
It all just confirms that Kaliningrad, this place that briefly tried to reinvent itself economically, has fully reverted to its most potent Cold War identity.
It was the westernmost Soviet military outpost, and today it serves the exact same strategic function. Only now, it's far more geographically isolated from the Russian mainland.
Especially with Finland and Sweden joining NATO.
The recent accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO seals it further into this oceanic isolation, surrounded entirely by hostile borders.
Which brings us to the final and probably the most high-stakes layer of this deep dive, the nuclear shadow hanging over the exclave. This persistent, unresolved question of whether Kaliningrad actually hosts nuclear weapons today.
This is an intensely complex and ambiguous area, and the ambiguity itself is a core strategic tool for Russia.
Yeah.
We know the U.S. and Russia hold the vast majority of the world's warheads, and we know a portion of U.S. tactical warheads is routinely stored in Europe, at sites in the Netherlands, Italy, Turkey, for example.
And on the Russian side, the official stated claim is that all their nuclear weapons are housed at just 12 central storage sites, deep within the country, not in forward positions like Kaliningrad.
What's fascinating here is that the official narrative is deliberately complicated by the unofficial reality that experts have mapped out. While they claim 12 central sites, independent satellite and intelligence analysis suggests they maintain at least 34 smaller, secret bases spread across the country.
34.
Plus at least one recently activated base in Belarus.
So the infrastructure to potentially store and deploy tactical weapons is much more widely distributed and flexible than the official statement would have you believe.
Exactly. The official line is that tactical warheads, which are lower yield, designed for battlefield use, remain in those central storage sites during peacetime. They're only moved to these smaller forward deployed bases, like potentially Kaliningrad, during periods of extreme military threat or crisis. So according to Moscow, officially, there are no nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad today.
But strategically, given the Iskander system's dual capability and the critical nature of the location, it seems almost counterintuitive for Moscow not to prepare that infrastructure.
That is the core conflict in the analysis. Russia strongly opposes any inspection of its storage sites. They demand the U.S. first remove its tactical nuclear weapons from Europe before any inspection talks can even resume.
So there's a stalemate.
A total stalemate.
Right.
And given that firm stance and the immense strategic importance of Kaliningrad as a forward deterrence post, most non-Russian experts agree that Kaliningrad most likely does have operational storage sites designed and maintained specifically for tactical nuclear weapons.
And these suspicions are no longer based purely on geopolitical logic. They're backed by very specific, detailed satellite intelligence.
Yes. The research is focused on 5 key secret bases across Russia's military geography, including a suspected location in Kaliningrad that have been undergoing extensive, large-scale renovations and modernizations since about 2016.
And these renovations have these telltale signs unique to nuclear capability.
They do.
What are those specific signs? What differentiates a nuclear storage site from just a standard high-security ammunition depot?
The security features are highly specialized, and they're standardized in Russian nuclear engineering. They include enhanced physical perimeter defenses, specifically triple-layer fencing separated by high-voltage zones rather than the standard double-layer.
Okay.
They feature elevated, covered guard posts with specific fields of fire. And most importantly, the sites include reinforced underground bunkers, often cut into bedrock, and standardized administrative buildings known to be associated with warhead handling and maintenance. These features are unique signatures of nuclear readiness.
And the specific suspected location in Kaliningrad shows evidence of this costly, specialized modernization.
It does. Satellite imagery over the site revealed activity consistent with nuclear infrastructure preparation. A hardened bunker was excavated, reinforced, and then subsequently reburied to enhance its protection.
Wow.
New, multi-layered specialized perimeter fences have appeared, and a new, very distinct guardhouse structure was recently constructed. This suggests long-term investment in maintaining the capability.
So this isn't just the general military upgrading we see everywhere. This is infrastructure specific to the highly secure, long-term storage and rapid deployment of the highest value military assets they have.
Correct. This modernization effort, which is being replicated across multiple strategic sites, signals that Russia is preparing for a long-term nuclear competition. They're ensuring the necessary secure infrastructure is in place to deploy warheads quickly to forward positions like Kaliningrad during a crisis.
And it's not happening in a vacuum.
Not at all. NATO was also modernizing its own nuclear weapons and delivery systems, purchasing new aircraft, upgrading its submarine fleet, and hardening its bases across Eastern Europe.
This all confirms that Kaliningrad is far more than just a conventional military flashpoint.
Yeah.
It's a region where the nuclear shadow, whether or not a single warhead is physically present today, hangs heavily over the entire geopolitical dynamic. It guarantees that this isolated exclave remains at the absolute center of escalating East-West tensions.
The arc of Kaliningrad's history is just. It's remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah.
It went from being an imperial German capital destroyed by war to becoming Stalin's explicit war aim in 1943 just to secure year-round naval power. After decades as the westernmost Soviet military outpost, there was that brief, tantalizing, hopeful moment of a Baltic Hong Kong, a vision of a modern, cooperative trade bridge with the flourishing European Union.
But the internal political priorities in Moscow, favoring centralization and dependence, coupled with the external pressures of NATO expansion, it just choked that economic vision.
It did.
The grand vision of Kaliningrad as a cooperative bridge between Russia and the EU is now, as the sources clearly state, farther away than ever before. The reality is that the region remains a potent, highly militarized symbol of Russian reach into the heart of Europe.
And that reach is deeply paradoxical, which is why it presents such a unique problem for Moscow. Kaliningrad's economy is profoundly dependent on Moscow's subsidies. It cannot survive independently. Its entire physical infrastructure is dedicated to serving the armed forces and the maintenance of deterrence capability.
But despite that massive investment in its strategic role, its geographic isolation, especially now that Finland and Sweden have joined NATO and the Baltic Sea has effectively become a NATO lake, that makes resupply and communication for that heavily armed military force incredibly difficult in any conflict scenario.
It's a profound strategic vulnerability disguised as a staging ground. And this raises an important final question for you, the listener, to consider. Given the exclave's total economic dependence on Moscow and this entire military infrastructure designed for forward deployment and war, does its isolation make it an indispensable, powerful strategic asset, the perfect tripwire and deterrent staging ground? Or does it make it a crippling geopolitical liability for Russia in this new era of prolonged tension? What is the long-term prognosis for a region that was designed exclusively for war and utterly failed at finding a viable path to peace?